There is a hadith, an authenticated saying of the Prophet Muhammad, collected by Bukhari and Muslim, the two most authoritative compilers in all of Sunni Islam, that describes what awaits the believer in paradise in terms so specific, so physical, so unambiguously sensory that most imams in the English-speaking world will not quote it directly from the pulpit, not because it is weak, not because it is disputed, not because scholars have questioned its authenticity, but because the details it contains create a set of theological problems that are far easier to avoid than to explain. The hadith describes, among other things, a man in paradise who will have the sexual capacity of 70 men. It describes rivers of wine in a place where wine is forbidden on earth. It describes physical pleasures of a kind that sit uneasily with the idea of a spiritual afterlife that transcends the body entirely. And it is not alone. The Quran itself, the literal word of God, according to Islamic belief, unchanged and unchangeable, contains descriptions of paradise that are among the most detailed, most sensory, and most theologically complex passages in any sacred scripture in the world. Descriptions that have generated 14 centuries of argument among scholars, mystics, philosophers, and ordinary believers. Descriptions that have been interpreted, reinterpreted, allegorized, defended, and debated, and that have never in all that time been fully resolved. Welcome to the channel where ancient secrets meet modern questions. The word for paradise in the Quran is Jannah, literally a garden. It appears over 100 times in the text, and the picture it paints is not the vague, luminous, disembodied realm of light that many modern religious people imagine when they think about heaven. It is specific. It is detailed. It is physical in ways that have made theologians uncomfortable for over 1,000 years. There are gardens beneath which rivers flow. There are rivers of water that does not go stagnant, rivers of milk whose taste never changes, rivers of wine delicious to those who drink it, and rivers of purified honey. There are fruits of every kind available at any moment, bending their branches low to be within reach. There are garments of silk and brocade. There are couches and cushions. There are cups and vessels and whatever the soul desires and whatever delights the eyes. And there are, in some of the most discussed and most debated verses in the entire Quran, figures described as her, a word that has been translated as virgins, as pure companions, as wide-eyed maidens, as beings of light who await the believers. This is the paradise that Muhammad described, not in vague metaphors, not in philosophical abstractions, in detail, with specificity, with the kind of concrete sensory language that makes you feel you could reach out and touch it. And the questions that specificity raises have never gone away. Is the paradise of the Quran and the Hadith meant to be understood literally? Is it a physical place with physical pleasures, or is it a symbolic register trying to point at something that transcends language? Who exactly are the her, and what is their relationship to the believing women who are promised paradise alongside the believing men? Why does paradise include wine when wine is strictly forbidden in this life? And what does Muhammad's own tradition, the vast body of hadith literature that supplements the Quran, add to the picture? And what does that addition reveal about the theological tensions that have always existed at the heart of Islamic eschatology? These are not questions that get asked at Friday prayers. They are not questions that appear on the curriculum of most Islamic schools. They are the questions that live in the footnotes of scholarly editions and the arguments of medieval theologians who disagreed fiercely about them, in the mystical writings of Sufi masters who tried to dissolve the problem by reading everything as allegory, and in the private thoughts of millions of ordinary Muslims who have read the Quran carefully enough to notice the details, and found that the official answers do not quite settle the unease. To understand why these questions are so difficult, you need to understand what the Quran is doing when it describes paradise and what the theological tradition has been doing with those descriptions ever since. You need to go back to the world in which the Quran was revealed. 7th century Arabia, a world of intense heat and water scarcity, where a garden with flowing rivers and abundant fruit was not a metaphor for luxury, but a literal vision of the most desirable existence imaginable. You need to understand the apocalyptic tradition that the Quran was entering into, the tradition of Jewish and Christian descriptions of the afterlife that had been developing for centuries before Muhammad's first revelation. And you need to understand the specific theological problem that physical descriptions of paradise create for a religion that is, in its philosophical core, radically committed to the absolute transcendence and incomparability of God, and by extension, to the idea that the ultimate destiny of the human soul should be something that transcends the merely physical. Let us start with the Quran itself and read it more carefully than it is usually read in public settings. The descriptions of paradise in the Quran are concentrated primarily in the later Meccan surahs and the Medinan surahs, the revelations that came after the early period of Muhammad's ministry, when the community of believers was growing and the question of what awaited the faithful after death was becoming increasingly urgent. Surah Al-Waqi'ah, the event, is perhaps the most detailed single passage in the Quran on the subject of paradise, and it is worth sitting with its language for a moment. It describes the foremost among the believers reclining on thrones of woven gold, facing each other, served by immortal youths circulating among them with cups and ewers and a goblet of pure wine, wine that will not cause headache or intoxication, and fruits of their choosing, and flesh of birds that they desire. And with them will be the hur, with beautiful, lustrous eyes, like pearls well protected, as reward for what they used to do. The passage continues with descriptions of shade and water and fruit that bends to meet the outstretched hand, and garments of silk and gold bracelets. This is not allegory in its surface form. It reads like a description of a banquet, a royal feast, in fact, the kind that the aristocracy of 7th century Arabia or of ancient Persia might have enjoyed, elevated to infinite and eternal perfection. The scholar of religion Nerina Rustamji, in her remarkable study of the Islamic Garden of Paradise, argues that the Quranic paradise draws deliberately on the imagery of the Persian royal garden, the paradisa, the walled enclosure of cultivated beauty and abundance from which the English word paradise is ultimately derived. When the Quran describes paradise as a garden with rivers and fruit and silk and gold and abundant food and beautiful companions, it is drawing on an image that its audience would have recognized as the ultimate statement of power, pleasure, and divine favor. It is saying everything that the most powerful human being on earth can enjoy, infinitely multiplied and eternally sustained, is what awaits the faithful. But this creates an immediate theological problem, because the Quran also insists repeatedly and emphatically that God is unlike anything in creation. The defining concept of Islamic theology is tawheed, the absolute unity and uniqueness of God, and one of its corollaries is that nothing in human experience can adequately represent the divine or the divine realm. When the Quran says that nothing is like God, it is making a statement that has profound implications for how we should read its own descriptions of paradise. If paradise is truly the dwelling place of God, if the ultimate reward of the believer is the vision of God, as the Hadith tradition insists, then how can it be fully captured in the language of gardens and rivers and silk and gold? Either those descriptions are literal, in which case paradise is a very elaborate physical place with surprisingly earthly pleasures, or they are symbolic, in which case the symbols are pointing at something that cannot be said directly. This tension has produced one of the longest and most sophisticated theological debates in Islamic history. On one side stand the literalists, the scholars who insist that the descriptions of paradise in the Quran and the Hadith must be taken at face value because God said what he meant, and the believer should not presume to allegorize the word of God. On the other side stand the philosophers and the mystics, the theologians influenced by Greek philosophy, the Sufi masters, and the rationalist tradition within Islam, who argued that the physical descriptions are accommodations to human understanding, pedagogical devices designed to make the promise of paradise intelligible to people who can only think in concrete terms, and that the true nature of paradise lies beyond anything that can be described in human language. The great medieval theologian Al-Ghazali, arguably the most influential Muslim thinker after the Prophet himself, the man who reconciled Sufi mysticism with Orthodox Islamic law in ways that shaped the entire subsequent tradition, wrestled with this tension throughout his career. In his monumental work, Ihya Ulum al-Din, The Revival of the Religious Sciences, Al-Ghazali presents what is effectively a dual-track theory of paradise. For ordinary believers, whose faith depends on concrete images and who cannot sustain themselves on pure philosophical abstraction, the physical descriptions of paradise are true and real and to be taken seriously. For the spiritually advanced, the mystics, the philosophers, the people whose inner lives have been sufficiently purified to grasp something beyond the merely sensory, the ultimate bliss of paradise is the vision of God, the direct contemplation of the divine reality. And this experience is so far beyond physical pleasure that it makes the rivers of wine and the silk garments and even the hur seem like children's toys. This is a sophisticated position, but it raises its own problems. If the physical descriptions of paradise are primarily for the spiritually immature, and if the true paradise is the beatific vision of God, then why does the Quran devote so much space to the physical details? Why does God choose this particular imagery if it is ultimately inadequate to the reality it is pointing at? And what happens to the believing women, the female companions of the Prophet, the mothers and daughters and wives of the faithful? Where do they fit in a paradise whose most famous images seem designed primarily around male desire? This brings us to the hur. The word appears 4 times in the Quran in Surah al-Dukhan, Surah al-Tur, Surah al-Rahman, and Surah al-Waqi'ah. It is the plural of the Arabic word hara, which refers to the quality of eyes in which the white is brilliantly white and the dark is intensely dark, a quality that Arabic poetry has always treated as the mark of exceptional beauty. The full phrase is usually hur al-ayn, the wide-eyed, the ones with beautiful eyes. And these figures are described in the Quran as a reward awaiting the believers in paradise. They are described as untouched, as pure, as confined to pavilions, as beautiful of eye, as like pearls well guarded. The question of who exactly the hur are has generated an enormous body of scholarship, and the answers range across a very wide spectrum. The most traditional interpretation, and the one that dominates popular Islamic imagination, is that the hur are supernatural female beings created by God specifically for the purpose of being companions and consorts to the male believers in paradise. This interpretation reads the Quranic passages in a straightforwardly literal way and takes the physical beauty language at face value. It is the interpretation reflected in the hadith literature, where Muhammad describes the hur in considerable detail, describing their transparency, their perpetual virginity that is renewed with each encounter, their devotion to their companions, and the scale of pleasure they provide. But this interpretation has always generated discomfort, and not only among modern readers trained in feminist sensibilities. Medieval scholars were also troubled by it, for reasons that were fundamentally theological rather than political. If the hur are supernatural beings created for physical pleasure, what does that say about the nature of paradise? Is the ultimate reward of a life of prayer and righteousness and self-discipline and devotion to God a life that included, among other things, the strict prohibition of extramarital sexual contact on earth, the provision of unlimited sexual access to supernatural beings in the next world? The logical structure of this interpretation has always seemed, to at least some Muslim thinkers, to reduce paradise to a kind of cosmic compensation scheme. You gave up the pleasures of the flesh in this life. Here are infinite pleasures of the flesh in the next. An alternative interpretation, developed by a range of medieval commentators and expanded by modern scholars, including the Pakistani scholar Fazlur Rahman and the American Muslim theologian Amina Wadud, reads, hur, not as supernatural female beings, but as purified companions, a term that applies to all believers, male and female, who will be transformed and perfected in paradise. On this reading, the hur are not a separate category of supernatural reward for male believers, but a description of the state of all the inhabitants of paradise, purified, beautified, restored to a perfection that transcends the limitations of earthly existence. The Arabic word on this reading is describing a quality of being rather than a category of creature. The linguistic argument for this interpretation is not negligible. The Quran also describes believers in paradise as mutually devoted companions, as dwelling together with their spouses, as reunited with their families. The picture of paradise in the Quran is not exclusively or even primarily about solitary male pleasure. It is a picture of community, of restored relationships, of the fulfillment of every legitimate longing of the soul. The hur on this reading are part of that picture of fulfillment rather than a separate category of supernatural concubine. But, and this is where the hadith literature becomes genuinely unavoidable, the Prophet Muhammad's own descriptions of paradise go considerably beyond anything that can be easily allegorized. The hadith collected by Tirmidhi and others describe the hur in terms of physical beauty so specific and so detailed that they resist symbolic reading. They describe the transparency of the skin of the women of paradise through which the marrow of the bones can be seen. They describe 70 garments, each visible through the other. They describe eyes so beautiful that the sun and moon would grow dim beside them. And the hadith about the sexual capacity of the believer in paradise, collected in Tirmidhi and attributed to the Prophet directly, states that the believer will be given the strength of 70 men in eating, drinking, desire, and sexual intercourse. This is not allegory. This is not a symbolic register. This is a tradition authenticated by the standards of classical Islamic hadith criticism that describes paradise in terms as concrete and physical as anything in the ancient world. The question of how to handle this tradition has divided Muslim scholars for centuries. The classical position, represented by scholars like Ibn Kathir and Ibn Hajar, is that the hadith is authentic and should be accepted, that the pleasures of paradise are real pleasures, elevated beyond earthly limitation, and that the believer should trust in God's promise without attempting to rationalize or allegorize what God has specifically described. The rationalist position, associated with the Mutazilite school of theology and with later modernist reformers, is that hadith of this kind must be evaluated not only by their chain of transmission, but by their compatibility with reason and with the overall theological picture of Islam, and that traditions which make paradise sound like an eternal brothel supervised by God are probably not capturing the true nature of the divine promise. The Sufi position, the most radical of all, is that the entire discourse about rivers of wine and beautiful companions is a concession to the spiritual immaturity of most human beings, and that the mystical tradition has always known that the true paradise is union with God, a state so far beyond physical description that any attempt to capture it in sensory language is necessarily a distortion. And then there is the wine. This is, in some ways, the most philosophically interesting problem of all, because it is the sharpest. The Quran prohibits the consumption of alcohol in this life with considerable force. The prohibition is stated clearly, and the reasoning given is that wine causes enmity and hatred between people and prevents the remembrance of God. And yet the Quran describes paradise as containing rivers of wine. The same text that forbids wine on earth promises wine in heaven. The standard resolution to this apparent contradiction offered by classical scholars and still taught in most traditional Islamic educational settings is that the wine of paradise is different from the wine of earth. It produces no intoxication, no headache, no loss of reason, no enmity. It has all the pleasure and none of the harm. But this resolution, while logically coherent, raises a further question that is rarely asked directly. If the wine of paradise is so different from the wine of earth that it produces none of the effects that made earthly wine prohibited, in what sense is it wine at all? What is the Quran pointing at when it uses the word wine for something that does not do what wine does? The Sufi tradition had an answer to this, and it was an answer that got a significant number of Sufi mystics into serious trouble with Orthodox authorities. For the Sufis, the wine of paradise was a symbol, the most potent symbol available in Arabic poetic tradition for the intoxication of the soul in the presence of God. The annihilation of the self and the divine, the state of mystical union that the Sufi masters described as the highest goal of human existence, felt like intoxication, the loss of boundaries, the dissolution of the ordinary self, the experience of a reality so overwhelming that ordinary consciousness could not contain it. Rumi's poetry is saturated with wine imagery. Hafez, the 14th century Persian poet, whose divan is the most widely read poetry collection in the Islamic world, uses wine as his central metaphor for spiritual experience throughout his entire body of work. For these poets and the traditions they represented, the Quranic wine of paradise was not a literal substance, but a symbol of the ultimate spiritual reality, a reality that could not be named directly and could only be approached through the most powerful images of earthly ecstasy that the tradition had available. But the Orthodox scholars were not wrong to be suspicious of this move, because once you start allegorizing the wine of paradise, where do you stop? If the wine is a symbol, what about the rivers of milk? What about the silk garments and the gold bracelets? What about the hur? What about the thrones and the cushions and the eternal youth of the servants? The allegorical method, once unleashed, threatens to dissolve the entire Quranic description of paradise into pure metaphor. And if paradise is pure metaphor, then the question of what it is actually pointing at becomes both more pressing and more unanswerable than ever. This is not a problem that has been solved. 14 centuries after Muhammad described the paradise that awaits the faithful, the theological community of Islam is still divided between those who take the descriptions literally and those who read them as symbols, between those who find the physical details theologically rich and those who find them theologically embarrassing, between those who see the vision of God as the culmination of paradise and those who see it as the replacement for everything else the Quran describes. And the division runs not only between different schools of theology, but within individual scholars and within individual believers, people who are quite certain about the basic contours of Islamic faith and who nonetheless find themselves genuinely unsure when they read Surah Al-Waqi'ah carefully at 2 a.m. exactly what they are being promised. What makes this more interesting still is that the Islamic tradition is not alone in facing this problem. The question of what the afterlife is like, whether it involves physical resurrection, physical pleasure, physical pain, or whether it transcends the physical entirely, has generated equally fierce and equally unresolved debates within Christianity and Judaism. The Christian tradition has its own version of this argument. The Apostle Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, describes the resurrection body as a spiritual body, something transformed beyond the physical while still being, in some sense, continuous with it. Medieval Christian theologians debated endlessly about whether the resurrection body would need to eat, whether it would experience sexual desire, whether it would be capable of physical pleasure. Thomas Aquinas characteristically tried to have it both ways. Yes, the resurrection body will have all the senses and all the capacities of the earthly body, but perfectly ordered, perfectly controlled, perfectly free from any disorder or excess. The beatific vision of God will be the overwhelming center of existence in heaven, but the senses will still be there, perfectly fulfilled. The Jewish tradition has been historically more reticent about the details of the afterlife than either Christianity or Islam. The Hebrew Bible is remarkably silent on the subject. Sheol, the realm of the dead in the older texts, is not a place of reward or punishment, but a gray, featureless underworld where nothing much happens. The detailed theology of resurrection and afterlife developed in the later Second Temple period, and Rabbinic Judaism has always maintained a certain deliberate vagueness about the specifics of the world to come, often quoting the Talmudic saying that eye has not seen nor ear heard what God has prepared for those who wait for him. This reticence was probably deliberate, an attempt to avoid the kind of theological overspecification that, as the Islamic case demonstrates, creates as many problems as it solves. And yet the problems do not go away simply by refusing to speculate. Whether you describe paradise in elaborate physical detail, as the Quran does, or refuse to describe it at all, as much of the rabbinic tradition does, you are still left with the same fundamental question. What is the human being, ultimately? Is the human being a soul trapped in a body for whom the body is a limitation that death will finally remove? Or is the human being a unity of soul and body for whom bodily resurrection and bodily pleasure in the afterlife are the natural completion of what was begun in this life? Your answer to that question will determine everything about how you read the descriptions of paradise, and the two most influential answers in the Western religious tradition have never been fully reconciled. The Islam that Muhammad founded was, at its core, a religion of embodied existence. The 5 daily prayers require a body standing, bowing, prostrating. The fast of Ramadan is a discipline of the body. The pilgrimage to Mecca is a physical journey. The prohibition of wine and pork and certain sexual behaviors is a regulation of the body. The entire structure of Islamic practice is built around the body as a site of worship and self-discipline, the body as the instrument through which the soul expresses its submission to God. A paradise that involved no body, no physical experience, no sensory fulfillment would be deeply discontinuous with everything the religion taught about the value and the sanctity of physical existence. And so the physical descriptions of paradise in the Quran and the Hadith are not perhaps as theologically naive as the rationalist critics suggest. They are a declaration that God's promise is not an escape from the human, but the human finally made whole.